Hey, what's up you guys, it's Connor. Today we're going to be doing an individual book review for Withered Sere by TJ Klune. This is the first book in the Immemorial series, and it is just a duology, I believe. I think it's just this one, and then it's Crisped and Sere. If you guys don't know, this is a post-apocalyptic adult science fiction novel that is set in what used to be Idaho. There may be more romance in the second book, but for this first one, there isn't really any romance. At the beginning of the book, you find out that the world as we know it was destroyed by nuclear warfare, and this book takes place 100 years after that all happened. We follow a man that's only known as Cavalo. He doesn't have a last name, at least he doesn't share his real name or last name with anyone. He lives on the outskirts of towns and only enters into a town if he really needs to. He has some acquaintances, but his best friend slash companion is his dog, which he calls Bad Dog. And throughout the course of this book, he has a lot of conversations with Bad Dog, like Bad Dog can actually respond, so that's a whole thing. He also has another companion that we'll talk about a little later. Cavalo is 40 years old at the very beginning of the novel, and he is very haunted by things in his past. He constantly hears these buzzing voices in his head, and for me, it was almost like self-doubt and just haunting memories were coming back and bothering him. Events unfold, and basically Cavalo cannot stay as isolated as he's managed to thus far in his life, and that causes problems for what he wants his life to be, as well as just everyone around him. The last thing that we'll talk about before we get into pros and cons is that in this post-apocalyptic world slash Idaho, there are people that are living in different villages. So as I said, Cavalo only goes into villages and towns if he really has to, but their territory is divided by this highway. And if you go on the other side of the highway, there are people that are called dead rabbits, and they will eat people, they're cannibalistic, and they're like really intense and violent. You don't want to go across the highway because bad things could possibly happen to you. This is the fourth book by TJ Klune that I've read. I've read The House in the Cerulean Sea, Wolf Song, Raven Song, and Bear, Otter, and the Kid. I've done individual book reviews for all of those, so I will leave them in a playlist down in the description as well as in the card symbol so you can check them out if you want to. I've decided to make TJ Klune a bit of a reading project for myself, so I've been going through a lot of his novels and I'm going to do individual book reviews on all of them, so stay tuned for all of those because I have like 4 more that I need to film. Anyway, as usual with my book reviews, I'm going to go through my pros, go through my cons, give you my rating, and be done. My first pro for this book is that I really like that TJ Klune experimented with this book. He wanted this book and this series to have a very different vibe than a lot of the books that he had come out with before these. He's most well known as a romance author, and I like that in this one he decided to take it into a darker direction. This book is a lot more grim than any of the other books that I've read by him. If you have any triggers, I highly suggest looking up what kind of triggers this book may have. There are things like attempted suicide, death of family members, torture, sometimes very graphic death scenes, toxic relationships, domestic violence, cannibalism, and extreme violence. There's probably more, but those are just the ones that I picked up on when I was thinking back on this novel. Yes, this novel is very bleak, but a lot of the character interactions had me laughing out loud. Most of these moments happen with Bad Dog because Cavalo gives Bad Dog a very sassy personality. Bad Dog and a character named Sirs go at it and have a very hate-love relationship, and I just loved that in this book. It made me laugh, and I was really enjoying their interactions. Stemming from that, another pro for me was the characters that we got to explore in this novel. I mentioned a character named Sirs. You don't get to meet Sirs until partway through the novel, but Sirs is a robot that lives at an old prison, which is where Cavalo lives with Bad Dog. Sirs really reminded me of Ben from Treasure Planet, the Disney movie Treasure Planet, because they have very similar kooky personalities. Sirs is slowly losing his mind, similar to how Ben was losing his mind, and I just really enjoyed that. I loved Treasure Planet because of how quirky and weird the characters were, and because Sirs reminds me of Ben, it made me love Sirs that much more. I forgot to say that this novel is also illustrated, so there is an illustration of Sirs, and that's Cavalo, and then Bad Dog is right there. I thought it was interesting that Sirs is slowly starting to break down. He is not as functional as he once was, and as he's breaking down, he starts to adopt more human characteristics. Sirs also will randomly start talking about something that he knows. He'll quote things like Pinocchio and Peter Pan and stuff like that. So I thought that those references were pretty interesting because this book does take place so long after humanity has been changed forever. A lot of those things have not survived into the future, and so I thought it was interesting that just little snippets of things that we are very familiar with are all that's left in this future post-apocalyptic world. I think at one point they talk about the Bible and how rare it is or something like that. Another character that I was really enjoying was Bad Dog. As I said, Cavalo gives Bad Dog a voice in his head, and so Cavalo has a lot of conversations with Bad Dog and fills in the answers that he thinks Bad Dog would give. It reminded me a little bit of how just I interact with Nook. I just make up random things that I think Nook is saying to me. So I like that that was in here as well. And you don't really know if Cavalo is as crazy as he seems, because Cavalo does get some information that I don't know how he would get it if Bad Dog was not able to communicate with him. I'm one of those people that prefers the animal characters in any book. I just want them to be happy, and if the dog is gonna die, it's gonna devastate me. I really just love dogs and dog characters, so I was really loving Cavalo and Bad Dog's relationship. Bad Dog is obviously super, super loyal, and I love how much Bad Dog loves Cavalo and how much Cavalo loves Bad Dog. Cavalo's relationship with Bad Dog is very interesting and is not as like rainbows and butterflies as you might think it is, and I liked learning about that in the later portion of the novel. Another character that I was enjoying but you don't get to know all that much about is this Dead Rabbit character that was in the image that I showed you already. They either call him the Dead Rabbit or they call him Psycho because he is very violent, he is very aggressive, and the character can't communicate orally because his tongue was cut off or something like that. So it was interesting to see them start to develop a way to communicate. If anyone is going to be the love interest for Cavalo, it's going to be this Dead Rabbit. He's really the only other character that could potentially be the love interest, so it'll be interesting to see if that plays out. One of the things that I thought was interesting about the beginning of their friendship, relationship, whatever they are, is that it really reminded me of Beauty and the Beast, how the Beast, in this circumstance would be Cavalo, keeps Belle, aka the Dead Rabbit, imprisoned and apart from everyone for a substantial amount of time. So I thought that there were some parallels there, and I wonder if that was done on purpose or not. And the last character that I'm going to talk about is obviously going to be Cavalo because he's the main character. He's described as a broken man in the blurb, and so I was interested to see how that was going to manifest and how it was going to be handled. He definitely has had terrible things happen in the past, which have affected him, and that's why he wants to be more isolated than most people in this world. Most people have a desire to be together and there's safety in numbers. Cavalo chooses to be on his own with Bad Dog and Sirs. I thought it was cool to follow Cavalo in this book and see him start to open up to other people, start to open up to the Dead Rabbit, start to realize that he might be better off with having more connections than isolating himself. He's definitely not a morally righteous character. He does do some pretty questionable things, or at least questionable in our time things. Because this is a lot more grim, he has to be a little bit more grim, and so there are things that he does that are quite violent, quite bloody, quite just intense, that kept me really engaged with the story because this world is just so much more brutal than our world. Well, parts of our world. I'm really curious to see what will happen in the future with his buzzing, haunting voices that happen to him and all of that. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I'm really curious about that. I touched on this earlier, but if there's going to be a romance, it's going to be between Cavalo and this Dead Rabbit character. They have a very interesting relationship that I don't think that everyone is going to enjoy following or support. I don't want to go into more detail than that, but it's not the healthiest of relationships. And also, as I've said in other reviews I've done for his books, TJ Klune often has age gaps between characters that are going to be romantic with each other. This one is one of the largest age gaps that I've seen in any of his books so far. The characters are just under 17 years apart, so that's quite a difference, but I guess in this post-apocalyptic world, there aren't that many people around. He's 40, and I think the Dead Rabbit is a little over 23. Just know that going in. My next pro for this book was the state of this world. It was interesting to see TJ Klune's take on a post-apocalyptic world 100 years after nuclear warfare. As I mentioned a little bit before, with the references to Pinocchio and Peter Pan and Edgar Allan Poe is something that people reference. It is interesting to see what random things have survived into the future. There isn't really a rhyme or reason which books make it, which stories make it into the future. It's just whoever had whatever on hand and which things just ended up surviving all the bombings. I thought that the world building was really well done, one because of that, but two because language is starting to evolve, and by starting to, I mean words are starting to be forgotten because they're no longer needed. In this post-apocalyptic world, a lot of the technology has not made it into the future. They don't have as many gadgets or just as many things as we have currently, so words have started to be forgotten because they don't really exist anymore. A lot of words that are related to different vehicles or different intellectual fields just are totally forgotten and are not used. Some scenes in this book have the characters questioning each other and asking about different vocabulary because no one uses those words anymore. So I thought that that was really well done because language is always evolving, and that's one of the things that I look for in books. In the future, they're not going to talk exactly how we talk today. In the past, they definitely did not talk how we talk today. So I love when books include those changes, and it was cool to see how it was done in here because words are just disappearing. Hey, Bubs. Nook's here, if you didn't know. Do you need something? Can I have a kiss? Give me a kiss. Good boy. This is Nook, my pup. I thought it was interesting how TJ Klune decided to create these different populations and how different they are from each other, even though they are so close together. How some people would decide to abandon our current morals and choose a different set of morals. As I mentioned, there are towns and villages where people have congregated together because there is safety in numbers, but there is this whole group of the dead rabbits that have rejected a lot of morality and are living a completely different life, and the only thing that separates them is this little highway. This world is a lot more harsh and justice is a lot more swift, so I thought that that was really interesting as well. A lot of things about the world building were interesting. And the last thing about the world building that I thought was interesting was how people would want to start to rebuild certain parts of society. It was fun to see which things people, at least in this fictional world, would want to reestablish as quickly as possible. So it was a good time following this world and seeing what was going on in it. And my last pro that I'm going to talk about is that I really like TJ Klune's writing. I've said this in all of my reviews, but I find his writing really easy to get through and really easy to get into. He has a very accessible writing style, but I will say that this book reads a lot more slowly than some of his others, and that's just because of the topic and the tone of the book. It forces you to slow down just a little bit, but I don't think that that was a bad thing. I think that this benefited from being read a little slower. Do you need something? I have a couple neutrals for this. The first is that a lot of the other characters are not as well fleshed out. Not that they don't have other things going on, but because Cavalo is so isolated by choice, we don't really get to see them all that much. So you really are just focused in on the four main characters, and you don't really focus in on anyone else, really. And my other neutral is that I think that these bees, this buzzing that happens with Cavalo, may annoy people. It didn't really annoy me, but because he does have that a lot, it is one of those things that stalls the plot a little bit while he's dealing with whatever the bees / buzzing is saying to him. It's a part of his character growth. These memories are haunting him and he has to deal with them, but it may annoy some people. Didn't really annoy me, but it might annoy you. As for cons, I only had a few. The first one is that I didn't understand why Sers at one point has to reboot himself, and I don't really know why that happens. I don't feel like it's really explained, and I didn't really understand it. It causes a lot of problems, and so I just didn't understand why it was happening at that current moment. That was a small con. As I mentioned before, this romance that may be unfolding is very different. And I don't know how I feel about it. As I said, it's not the healthiest of relationships, so I'm curious to see how it continues on into the second book. We'll see. And my biggest con for this is that the ending of this book is not as satisfying as many of TJ Klune's other book endings. It doesn't have as much catharsis. The book pretty much just ends. There's a very dun 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 moment right before it ends, but nothing else has been solved and nothing else has been really wrapped up in any way. It's one of those books where you definitely want to have the second one on hand so that you can continue along straight away. All of my questions and all of my unease is still with me right now, and I wish that at least one thing had been solved or had just been wrapped up a little bit so that there was some catharsis when you finish the book. That said, there is a second book, and I do currently have it in my house, so I will be able to continue on very shortly and see what's going on next, but I do prefer when books have at least one thing wrapped up so that I feel good about myself when I finish. So in the end, I had a lot of pros for this. I really liked the characters. I really liked the tone of this. It is so different than a lot of his other books that I've read so far, so I was really appreciating that. I really love when authors experiment and try different genres and try different just moods and stuff with their books, and so I liked it in here. I like the world and everything like that. My really only big con was I didn't really love the ending of this because it left me a little unsatisfied, but now I'm going to jump into the second book very soon, and I'll be able to let you guys know how that one is. With all of that, I ended up giving Withered Sere 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and as I said, I'm going to be continuing on shortly. So that's going to be my review on Withered Sere by TJ Klune. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up and comment down below if you've read this book. What were your thoughts on it? Oh, you want to scratch yourself? Sorry, buddy. Anything else you want me to know, leave it down below and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye. Say bye. Good boy. Bye.